You're watching CGTV, Community Government Television, Channel 11, Pitkin County, City of Aspen, and Town of Snowmass Village.
The City of Aspen, established in 1881, has over 220 full-time employees, a number that swells to more than 425 with the addition of seasonal and temporary workers. Organized into more than 20 departments, the City of Aspen provides major amenities like parks, a rec center, and open space, and services like utilities and police and Kids First to its residents and visitors. From the golf course to the Community Development Department, the Wheeler Opera House to the Parking Department, the City of Aspen and its employees strive to do the best job possible. A major goal of the city is keeping open communication between the government and the citizens. Welcome to City Matters, a show where the city does matter, and matters of the city are brought to you. Hi, and welcome to City Matters. I'm Mitzi Rapkin, Communications Manager for the City of Aspen, and on this show we talk about all things city. Today we're going to talk about a very important project the city is undertaking about water planning called Integrative Resource Planning, and we have some special guests today. We have John Rehring, who is a Vice President at Carollo Engineers, one of our consultants. Tyler Christoff, he is the Utilities Director for the City of Aspen. And Inge Wiersema, who is also a Vice President at Carollo Engineering, one of our consultants on this IRP project. Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. So we're going to start off just kind of introducing ourselves, sharing what you do, and why you're here today. So let's start with you, Inge.
Okay, so my name is Inge Wiersema. I work for Carollo Engineers, as you mentioned. I am the Water Resources Practice Lead for the company, which means that nationwide I help utilities do water resources planning. And I've been doing that for about 25 years. And I'm very excited to be here to help the City of Aspen with this integrated water resource plan.
Great.
And I'm Tyler Christoff. I am the Director of Utilities for the City of Aspen. I work with our water and electric staff to deliver those services to the Aspen community on a daily basis.
All right.
And I'm John Rehring, also with Carollo Engineers. I work on managing projects, looking at water supplies, comparing demands to available supplies and projecting those out into the future, and helping communities make good choices about how to meet those demands in the future.
Great. So the main reason that we are where we are right now as a City of Aspen and why you're here today is to do some long-term planning for our water resource for the community, which we don't really have a big long-term plan. So when you do this, it's called an IRP. So what is an IRP, if you can say again what it is, and then kind of drill down a little more so people can understand?
Sure, I think an integrated resource plan is really a master planning process that a utility or a community can undertake to really look at the resources we have, our infrastructure, and really gather feedback in a holistic manner to plan for the future. And really what the City of Aspen has done is tried to engage a very qualified team to help us with that process. And I would definitely turn to Inge and John to help elaborate on what they view as a integrated resource planning process.
Sure. Yeah, so one of the first things you do when you do an integrated resources plan, you start with looking at what are the water demands, what are your water needs. So we're projecting it out, depending on the plan. This can be 2, 3, or 4 decades into the future. So we're really getting ourselves out there, thinking about what a community could look like in terms of water demands and growth. And then we look at the existing water supplies and look at the reliability of those. And if there's a gap between the amount of water that is available and the amount of water that we project that is needed, we're looking for different alternative supply options or management strategies to make sure that there is enough water in the future. So we develop multiple alternatives, compare those, use some criteria that reflect different community needs, and come up with a strategy that will provide reliable and robust water supply for decades to come. So helping the city with a roadmap of making important decisions, being really proactive about it.
I know too, John, in some of the materials that you have presented, also talk about that this isn't just water planning, that even billing comes into it, rate structure comes into it. So are there other elements besides those that I mentioned that we are thinking about, and why?
Sure. So one of the reasons we do long-term planning is because, first of all, it can take a long time to implement new water supplies if we see a need for that, both between permitting, funding and financing. All those things play into it. So it can take decades to meet that. So we need to look that far in advance. And so all of those elements definitely come in. It's not just the technical elements, but it's also the funding and financial elements that go with that, and making sure that we've got something that's implementable and sustainable through the long term.
I mean, this seems like a basic question, but why is having an integrated resource plan important for cities and governments?
I think from a municipality perspective, it's not a natural act for local governments or even just individuals to plan out past their lifespan. And so this is really taking a process and implementing it and being able to provide us in the community a vision for that future, and hopefully a sustainable vision for that future.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of like a gift to future generations to not leave them high and dry.
Absolutely.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, it looks at all the existing infrastructures out there that took bold action from people in the past to make that happen, that there is water treatment plans that treat to the current water quality regulations. So when you do integrated resources planning, you also look at new water quality regulations that may come down the line, vulnerabilities, climate change. So there's a lot of different factors that come to play. So it's important to think far enough ahead and determine what are good strategies, and also involve the community in the process to make it transparent, so that when the recommendations are put forward, people understand why these investments are needed to sustain the community.
Yeah. So in order to end up with you as our team, the city did put out an RFP. And John, you sort of led that RFP process. And when we're talking about why IRPs are important for cities and government, what did you kind of see in Aspen that was interesting to you about why you ended up here today?
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the things, and Inge touched on this a little bit, but we're focused increasingly on water supply resiliency, so that our supplies will be there under a whole range of different conditions, and those can be kind of near-term or long-term. In Aspen in particular, we know that there is a shortage of water storage, something on the order of a quarter day worth of storage, which really does not provide much protection for any kind of emergency situations that we might encounter any time. So we understand that, and we see that there's a real need to address that through additional storage in the city, but also thinking about other types of risks that are out there. For example, a potential wildfire in the watershed that could affect water quality feeding into our water system. We need to be prepared for those and have a system that's robust and resilient to those kinds of threats that are there that really could happen any time. And then longer term, climate change definitely has the potential to impact snowpack and runoff patterns. And when we're on a community or on a water system here that's fed only by creek flow, and again without that storage, then that's a real risk as well to our water supply and our ability to reliably meet demands in the long term.
Yeah, I think that idea is sometimes hard as a communication person to get across to the community, because you turn on your tap and you have water. You want to take a shower, you want to water your flowers. We have that. But like last year, we had a very bad avalanche that blocked that flow of water. So had the team not responded in an incredible, fast and swift way to clear that, maybe by the next day, when you turn on your tap, it wouldn't be there. And getting people to understand that is really why we're doing this. So an event like that, if that happens, maybe we have a backup source, maybe we have storage. So what types of water sources and water uses are being considered when you develop an IRP?
Well, that varies a lot on where the location is and what the options are. I mean, water conservation, although it's not a wet supply, is a strategy, and that we see as a supply source. You have your creek supplies, groundwater. In some cases, you can do reuse, basically treating wastewater and treating it to a quality that you can inject in the ground and store it below and pump it back out and treat it. So there's reuse regulations in place to do that in a responsible manner. And then some agencies also have other water supplies to their disposal to evaluate, like ocean desalination or brackish groundwater, of course, where we can do that here. So it's a variety of supply options that need to be considered, and storage is going to be a really important one here. It's not as a supply, but just kind of dealing with the fluctuations in demands and supplies on a daily basis, or even on a regional or like a seasonal basis that need to be considered.
I think Aspen has a lot of opportunities being relatively high in the watershed, but those opportunities also come with constraints based on our topography, our climate, our demands, etc. And really we look to this team and the community to help guide us in those discussions and really hone in on what's most practical to serve the community in the long run. And I think it's going to be some sort of menu of options or portfolio of different sources. So that kind of remains to be seen, and really that's what this process is about.
And kind of the reality of that too has to do with how, as a city, what we have rights to, right? You can't just take water and be like, oh, we want this. You know, that has been an important part of the city, is protecting those rights and finding the best way to use them for the community.
And I think that's a really good point too, is it's easy to perceive that there's a lot of water here. We see it on the mountainside, we see it in our creeks and so forth, but just because it's there doesn't mean you have the legal right to use it. So really two things have to come together: the physical availability, the water has to be there, and then you have to have the legal right to use it as well.
Yeah. You were mentioning earlier, and I just want to make sure we covered it all, you were talking about wildfires and climate change and, you know, potentially avalanches. Are there any other sort of threats or risks that we should mention to our water supply? Or did we cover them all?
I think those are the main ones. One of the other critical, interesting things here in Aspen, of course, is that you have fluctuating demands with, you know, whether it's season or non-season, and there's people coming into town and changing their demands pretty drastically. And so we need to think through that when we do water supply and water demand budgets. So that's another risk that we kind of need to really think about in the future, how are these demand peaks going to be managed.
And I would add that, you know, Colorado is a state that's growing rapidly from a population standpoint. We are not the only people in the state that are looking for water. There's huge pulls to the Front Range east of the Continental Divide, and even on the western slope, that growth really there's needs that water needs around that growth. So, you know, we're not only competing with our local region, but generally the state and the larger arid West. So, you know, we're trying to make sure we have a resilient plan for our community for the future, but in the context of that larger scope.
Right.
Yeah. So once you start thinking about the IRP, it's separated into phases. So we have phase 1 and phase 2. Can you talk a little bit about those phases?
Sure. So Aspen's doing a really great job with that, thinking it through very deliberately in this first phase, which we're just starting now, which is to really get a lot of input from all kinds of different viewpoints within the city, but also thinking about the community's input as well, and planning out how we're going to develop the IRP. So phase 1 is really kind of that visioning and setting the goals for the IRP, and then phase 2 will be where we actually put that into motion. Inge likes to call it, we're planning the work now, and then phase 2 we'll work that plan and execute what we've laid out.
Yeah.
But really taking a deliberate effort up front to make sure that we've thought this through, we get all the right inputs from the whole community in terms of what's important to the community and how we make that supply more resilient through the future, and then move forward and execute that plan in phase 2.
Right. And then another thing we're doing in phase 1 is we're looking at all the existing information that's already available and looking, are there gaps, are there inconsistencies, can we build upon previous studies that have been done, just to be really efficient and not reinvent the wheel, really kind of picking up where other studies have left off. So we're doing a data inventory also in phase 1 and doing all these interviews, and then together developing really a detailed plan for what are the components of the IRP in phase 2. And this is a pretty unique approach that the City of Aspen is taking to really carve out that phase 1 of planning the work first, instead of already thinking you know how you're going to do it from the beginning. So I think this will really make the process more efficient, but also defining the desired outcomes up front will ensure that the end product will meet the community needs, and thinking through all the type of benefits and concerns that need to be considered in the plan. So this is a pretty interesting approach to carve it out in these two phases, and that's one of the things that we were really interested to work with the City of Aspen.
Yeah. A lot of times I think about things in metaphors, and some metaphor I came up with today, even though it sounded a little morbid, was like a water wheel. So phase one is really, we're looking at our assets, we're looking at our gaps, we're looking at what we want to leave future generations, and who are the players that can give us those assets, or the health care that we need. And then phase two, we actually come up with like the will, what we want to leave our community. And it's much more responsible to pass on something than nothing. So it is very good. So who are the players that are helping us sort of create the overall picture of what we have, what we don't have? Who are you tapping into, what resources for phase one and phase two?
So I think the utility obviously has a number of internal resources and staff expertise that will certainly contribute to the project. But we don't want to do this project inside an echo chamber. So really, we're looking out to the community, other stakeholders, other water rights holders, other water rights users, environmental organizations, those types of folks that we really want to hear from as part of this process and engage, because we know that there's a lot of collective intelligence in the community to help solve these types of problems.
And I think internally it's also really important for the community to know that even within the city, there's different players. Like community development is an important one to talk to. Absolutely. Because if we talk about development, then water is going to be a part of it. So I know this week you're engaging a lot of internal departments.
Yeah, so we're going to talk with engineering and with the water operations, but also with planning and recreation. And so we're having different city departments that we're going to interview with, so to really hear all the concerns and looking at water needs through different lenses, so we can really kind of map that out and understand the full picture. And then next week there's going to be additional interviews to meet with the mayor and understand on the community side of things, and laying out who are the people in the community that we want to tap into and work with during the IRP process. So that's sort of the inventory stage that we're in right now, and getting all that input up front and the different lenses will help develop a scope that takes care of all those elements that need to be part of it.
Yeah.
It's really pretty amazing when you think about what is impacted by water use, or what impacts and drives water use, and how many different areas that touches in a city, in a community. And so we're trying to touch on all of those and get input from all those different kind of perspectives to help us shape where this IRP goes and make sure that it does meet the community needs, as Inge pointed out.
Yeah, and I think one thing to build upon that is that there's this thing called like One Water thinking now. That's sort of like the integrated resources planning plus, as I call it. Like it's an advanced way of looking at water planning. And so you start interacting and collaborating with departments and agencies and stakeholders that not all have water as their primary focus. So when you talk about growth, you talk about a housing department, or you can take with transportation. Is there ways to capture stormwater in a way when you do a new roadway or green infrastructure improvements? So by working with departments that not always have water on their mind, but doing that in the planning process, you can come up with more smart, integrated solutions that ultimately will result in more sustainable communities by taking water as part of every planning decision, because every community needs water. As you said, you turn the tap on, you want to make sure the water comes out. And it's not on everybody's mind, and that makes sense. So that's our job, to make sure we talk to all the right people to start thinking about water from their lens and work together.
Yeah. And I think that, Tyler, that's something that I think the utilities is doing a really wonderful job at, is aligning the city. So if you have those players from the very beginning, like the kindergarten steps before we get to our PhD and IRP, then you have that alignment and you can move together really as a team, which is really important.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Have you guys, I know you've done IRPs in other communities. What sort of challenges have you seen are sort of the biggest ones in creating an IRP?
Well, I think two key challenges come to mind. One is sort of a boring one. It's data. You know, there's always a lot of data to gather, and there's always data gaps and inconsistencies. So that's the technical part that we work through. But then the one that's a little bit more interesting and challenging and unique to each IRP is what criteria do you use to evaluate alternatives. So a lot of times you take a one sort of benchmark or a do-nothing alternative where you say, well, if we continue the status quo, what would the water supply picture look like in, let's say, year 2050 or year 2060? And then you build different alternatives and you compare them. But how do you compare them? So this is where the community involvement comes in play too. Like there's recreational benefits to consider, there's environmental benefits, there's water supply resiliency, of course, there's cost, there's how easy it is to implement things. Here you have water rights constraints. So we need to look at all these different factors that are unique to Aspen and come up with criteria that are reflective of the community's priorities. And that's always a challenging part in the IRP process to reach consensus or agreement, or like these are our criteria. So when we evaluate these options, that in the end of the day, when we propose a certain strategy, that this would reflect the needs of the community at large. And so that's a very interesting part of the process that can be challenging.
It really boils down to trade-offs. We're weighing different trade-offs. We want kind of everything, but we can't have everything. For example, cost and reliability is a great example. We want something that doesn't cost a lot, but provides a lot of reliability. But to what degree of reliability do we want to take that? Do we want to prepare for a drought that might happen once every 1,000 years? And the cost that would go into making that system robust against that kind of a threat? Or once every 10 years, where we wouldn't have to put in as much redundancy or backup systems. So where are those trade-offs, right? What's the right balance there? And that's very community specific. And so we think about not just what are the criteria, but how important are they relative to one another. And that's more about the values of the community in making those trade-off decisions about what's really right for Aspen.
Have you seen, like, what have you seen out there in other communities be like a really interesting maybe trade-off or just an interesting moment in their IRP process?
I have a great example. I think for the city of Los Angeles, we did a really big One Water plan. And of course, they're next to the ocean, and they're in a state where water is scarce, and a lot of water is imported from 300-400 miles away. So that brings some challenges in terms of reliability with reducing snowpack. So looking for new local supplies is a big push. And so looking at reuse and conservation, but then ocean desalination is another option. So there was a really interesting process working with the city and the community, because the community was not in favor of ocean desalination, although of course it's sort of an unlimited amount of water, but for the carbon footprint or the energy footprint and the environmental concerns of taking the salt out of the ocean and then pumping it in, the community, the huge transmission lines was not as favorable as doing reuse, so treating wastewater to recycled water standards and putting it into the groundwater basin. So very interesting opportunity that was out there, and by working with the community, really making a conscious decision, let's use our aquifers, let's push reuse first, and then if we get down the line and that would not be enough, then maybe desalination is down the future. But that is one example of a process that we went through where we really disregarded that as an opportunity for at least the near term, next few decades.
So if we were looking out and we were looking at Aspen in, say, 2022, 2023, the IRP is done, we've started implementing, like, what do you see as what we have accomplished and what it might look like?
So I think we'll have a lot better picture of what the future demands look like and what the different existing supplies can do to meet those demands, and we'll have matched those up and understood what the risks and potential shortages are in the future in the light of all those different risks that are out there and threats that are out there. And then we'll also have compared different alternatives to say, okay, what's really best to meet that need long term, near and long term, with an implementation plan to get us there. So we'll know not only what the future looks like if we don't do anything, if we do kind of the do nothing, and then we'll have sifted through alternatives to say, here's the best way to address that future scenario that we can envision, and we'll have a plan and understand how we need to start implementing that over time to really meet that need and head off any potential issues in the future.
And I think from the city's perspective, that question kind of sounded like, what does success look like for 2 years down the road? And for me, it's really having the community understand better our water system and all the elements that surround it and support it, and really kind of appreciate that and feel like we have honored their values with this plan. Internal to the utility, it really gives us the opportunity to have tangible deliverables that we can implement over time, and that's an exciting output of this process that we're looking forward to as well.
Any last thoughts about that success?
Well, I think having a clear roadmap that is developed through a transparent process with the community and all these different departments that we mentioned earlier really puts the city on the road to success and be able to be proactive and make the right decisions at the right time. We call that like a trigger-based implementation strategy. You can maybe look at extremes in the future, and you don't have to implement everything right now, but if you have a roadmap and you can monitor those triggers, you can be on time and make sure you make the right decisions before, to ensure a good water supply future for the city of Aspen.
I see the city of Aspen as a very well-hydrated city in the future. So right now we are in phase 1. This is November 2019. This is really the internal process that we're doing now. So this is not as much about the outreach and the stakeholder. We will finish up this phase around the end of January. So in early 2020 is when phase 2 will go on, and that's really the opportunity for the community to give feedback and to be more involved, and that process might take about a year.
Right.
So we're looking forward to engaging the community with that, and look for more at the City of Aspen, and we look forward to working with you over phase 1. So thank you so much. And if people have questions, they can go to the utilities page and give Tyler a call anytime. His information is on there, or give me a call and we can route you to the right place. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Cheers.
Cheers.
Aspen Tap.
Cheers.
You're watching CGTV, Community Government Television, Channel 11, Pitkin County, City of Aspen, and Town of Snowmass Village.
The City of Aspen, established in 1881, has over 220 full-time employees, a number that swells to more than 425 with the addition of seasonal and temporary workers. Organized into more than 20 departments, the City of Aspen provides major amenities like parks, a rec center, and open space, and services like utilities and police and Kids First to its residents and visitors. From the golf course to the Community Development Department, the Wheeler Opera House to the Parking Department, the City of Aspen and its employees strive to do the best job possible. A major goal of the city is keeping open communication between the government and the citizens. Welcome to City Matters, a show where the city does matter, and matters of the city are brought to you.